Following this first wave to the seaports and coastal areas of the world, the next natural step was taken by missionaries, in which we call the second wave of modern missions. And this was, once they'd landed in the coastal areas, the seaports, many of them began to realize, now wait a minute, people don't just live here in the coastal areas, they live in the interior as well. And we need to reach them for Christ. So the second wave of modern missions was to the interiors of nations. And this was a huge emphasis following the first wave from the 1850s to the 1930s. And I want to mention three different individuals here that kind of stand out in God's kind of Hall of Fame. The first one is a man you all will recognize because he was the most famous person after probably Napoleon of the 19th century. His name was David Livingstone. David Livingstone, who was born in the latter part of the 18th century. He was a Scot from Scotland, part of the British Empire. Actually wanted to go to China as a missionary, but it didn't work out. So he ended up going to South Africa. He, like others, came down to England, got on a boat, traveled in a boat many months, and arrived at today what is the Republic of South Africa, right down here at the tip. He arrived there in 1841. He worked there as kind of a quote-unquote normal missionary for a period of time, especially in an area today we would call Botswana. Saw a chief come to Christ and a number of others, so he was very much involved in mission work. He then sent his family back to England in 1852, and it was after that that he became famous because he felt at that point one of the greatest things that he could do would be to kind of open up the African nation to others to be able to come. Now, Africa was not called the dark continent in history for no reason for a long time. And this wasn't a reflection on the skin color of the people. For thousands of years, in various parts of the civilized world, especially Europe, there was no knowledge of Africa. Who lived in the center of Africa? No one had ever been there. No one had ever seen the tribes. It was a darkened continent, totally cut off from the light of Christ. There had been an early church in the northern part for a period of time. That had become Muslim over the centuries. The rest of Africa shrouded in darkness and in poverty. So Livingstone decided he was going to check it out. Kind of God using his natural motivation as an adventurer to travel. And ultimately, over his lifetime, what Livingstone did was he took 3 major trips across Africa. He was the first man, as far as we know, outside of Africa to travel the entire continent from south to north. He had a wonderful discovery. I've been there in past years. He was the first European to discover Victoria Falls in South Africa. He then began to write about his journeys, came back and actually traveled the country also from the west to east, and then another trip, 3 major trips across the African continent. And he wrote his first book on this called Missionary Travels in 1857, and it utterly fascinated the peoples of the world. I mean, people enjoyed it just from a standpoint of culture and, flora and fauna and peoples, but it also began to inspire all kinds of missionaries about, wow, there's all kinds of people in the middle of this huge continent. I remember one time getting on an airplane, in London or Amsterdam somewhere and flying down to South Africa. This was a number of years ago. That's a 12-hour flight over a huge continent. Well, it was David Livingstone who opened that continent up. I'll give you 2 little phrases of his that kind of became famous. His ethic was this: fear God and work hard. Fear God and work hard. That was the aspect of his life. And then he said his mission in life in Africa was to promote Christianity, commerce, and civilization. All 3 of those things were needed. You might remember in 1871, he had a famous meeting with a man named Henry Stanley. Dr. Livingstone, I presume. as Stanley came out of a clearing and found this missionary had kind of been lost, and they had their famous meeting. David Livingstone was actually found dead on his knees in Africa in 1853. And was so beloved by the African people, they buried his body in Africa, but they took his heart actually back to Buckingham Palace, where he was enshrined as kind of a saint of English history. But God used Livingstone to expose, as a missionary, the treasures, the riches, the peoples of Africa via his writings. All kinds of people read it. Again, he was the most known person other than Napoleon in the entire 19th century. And all kinds of Christians says, we've got to go there. And they began to get on the boats, go to the coastal areas, and again, go into the interiors of the country. A second major figure in the second wave of modern missions is another famous missionary. His name is J. Hudson Taylor. J. Hudson Taylor. An Englishman who was, of course, called to China and became the founder of what became the world's biggest missionary society during this time period. It became known as the China Inland Mission. And of course, the name tips you off as to the era that we're in. Taylor himself got on a boat. Took him 4 months to travel all the way around to China. Eventually got there, landed in Shanghai in China. It's right up here somewhere, Shanghai. And he noticed that almost all the missionaries were still working in the coastal seaport areas. Robert Morrison had been down in the Macau area. The others were now north. But he began to kind of take excursions into the center of China, and he learned at that time, a couple hundred years ago, there were 200 million Chinese in the center of China that had never heard of Jesus. So he launched the China Inland Missions. He served there with his wife and team and went back and forth to England, wrote books, recruited, did a lot of things over about 50 years. By the time he died, there were 800 missionaries serving in inland China in 205 mission stations that had led 125,000 Chinese to Christ. And within another 50 years, there were 4,000 China Inland missionaries. One of the geniuses of Hudson Taylor was, besides his tremendous zeal and passion for the Chinese people, was his total identification with them. He became Chinese. That was kind of a new thing. When some of the first missionaries went out, they took their culture with them, kind of had their mission stations. They looked English. They acted English. They wanted to kind of eat English foods and that kind of stuff. I mean, I'm not saying that was wrong. It was just they hadn't learned yet. Hudson Taylor said, when I come to China, I got to become Chinese. So he grew a ponytail. He wore their clothes. He slept. He ate. He lived. He became them. Huge step in missions strategy, actually, what we call cultural identification. He died in 1905. And it was really their work that really laid the foundation for the modern day work in China. They have the greatest influence in that, and again, part of reaching the interiors for Christ. Livingstone in Africa, the African interiors, and Taylor in China. The third one I want to mention, I'll mention a couple people here, is a man named John Mott. John Mott, who's an American. C.T. Studd, who was a cricket player. He was an Englishman. And a movement they were a part of, which became known as the Student Volunteer Movement. During the middle part of the 19th century, a number of revivals had taken place in England and in America. In fact, a famous prayer meeting called the Haystack Prayer Meeting had taken place in the northeast part of New England. In fact, Adoniram Judson had been saved as a result of that Haystack Prayer Meeting. And as young people began to pray, John Mott basically became a missions mobilizer who went from campus to campus to campus in America. He eventually took 100 trips across the Atlantic in boats, 12 trips across the Pacific to Asia, basically stirring the fires and inviting students, young people, college students, to get involved in world missions. He and many others, C.T. Studd was a part of this, who actually became a mobilizer too and ended up in the Congo. I was actually trained in my early years by a man who was an understudy of C.T. Studd. And what a tremendous privilege that was. Studd went to Africa. Mott basically stayed in America, besides going back and forth all the time. But by the end of his life, he had mobilized 20,000 young people, mainly college students, to get involved in global missions. And he also led the first global missionary conference, which was called the Edinburgh Missionary Conference in 1914. So the student volunteer movement prior to the 20th century was the largest single kind of missionary thrust of all time. It was during a time period in which missionaries were going everywhere, books were being written, the world was kind of being opened by exploration, and God began to motivate students and their organizers to say, we need to go. We need to go into all these nations and share the riches of Christ. The reason that Kenneth Scott Latourette calls 1815 to 1914 the great century of missions is because 1815 is when Napoleon died and the wars kind of stopped in Europe, and so a tremendous advance in the gospel took place. 1914 is when the first global missions conference took place, and of course World War I also started. And it was in that 100-year time period, there was this huge thrust in world evangelization. It was fueled by the student volunteer movement and many other missions groups. I'll also mention in this category, and this will really encourage those of you that are females. This was the time in which women began to get involved in missions for the first time. And you know what the main reason for that was? The American Civil War. Because of the Civil War, 600,000 American young men died. That left a huge vacuum both in agriculture, commerce, and in missions. And so women began to say to themselves, we can go, we must take their place. And I'll mention three very quickly that went. One was a woman named Lottie Moon. If you're a Southern Baptist, you've heard of Lottie Moon. 1840 to 1912. She was one of the first Southern Baptist missionaries to China in 1873. Became utterly famous. They still take offerings to this day. The Lottie Moon offering for world missions takes place. Lottie Moon was 4'3". She was no big towering individual, but she got involved in teaching, schools, evangelism, that was really her heart, hundreds. And then she wrote voluminous letters back and forth to America and many other places asking for more workers. Her call was, only women can reach women. And many began to come. A second woman I want to mention is a woman named Mary Slessor, spelled with an O-R at the end, Mary Slessor. She was a Scot from 1876 to 1915. God led her to go to West Africa, what became primarily Nigeria. She was especially involved in rescuing children. It was a practice in Africa then to do two things. Number one, if you had twins, that was a bad omen, so they were abandoned in the woods. So she saved many babies. The other thing was in Africa at that time, there was still much child sacrifice. And so she was involved in rescuing children throughout her lifetime. Many aspects of evangelism, many aspects of education became just a noble missionary to the African continent. A third one that I would mention is Amy Carmichael, which maybe some of you have heard of. She was Irish, 1895 to 1951. Amy Carmichael got on a boat and went to India. Whereas William Carey had gone to southern India, she went to northern India. I'm sorry, the other way around. Carey went to northern India, she went to southern India, in Madras in southern India, sorry. Got involved in starting a group called the Dohnavur Fellowship. Their main focus at that time was in India, in the Hindu temples, there was an awful lot of prostitution going on and child abuse, what we call today sex trafficking. So they got involved in saving child prostitutes, first of all girls and then eventually boys as well. And toward the middle part of her life, she had a fall and became a cripple, was in a wheelchair for an awful long time, went through all kinds of suffering as all these missionaries did. But it was actually in her later years, she wrote something like 35 books. 35 books. And never focused on herself. She didn't like photographs, never took photographs of herself. And she said this when she died: upon a life I did not live, upon a death I did not die. Another's life, another's death, I stake my whole eternity. You get the focus there of a person whose life is totally wedded to Christ and didn't think about her own. Today, there are actually many more women missionaries in the world. One of the most famous ones today is Heidi Baker in Mozambique, for example. The whole world knows about Mother Teresa, also in India. And you might not know that the vast majority of the Chinese house church leaders today, those are the main pastors of China, are women. And 60% of today's missionaries globally are women. Now you gotta let that sink in a little bit. We're talking about 1,850 years going by in which women were not very much, except as occasional wives, involved in world evangelization. But starting in the 1850s and now into the 20th and 21st centuries, women have just exploded into world evangelism, where today, in just 150 years, they are 60% of the global missions force. That's incredible. Praise the Lord.